That jive ass turkey better have my motherfucking butter. Every time you see me, I got Adidas on, but I still can check a bitch, so better watch your tone. I'm the original Brodie, I'm the Tyrone they clone. Feeling tempted to roll it up and get in my zone. Rhythmic tones, frequencies hitting pyramid domes, can lift up only through sound, and that's the shit that I'm on. Cryptic and shit in my prose, as I'm dignitizing a pro. A snake charmer, I'm told, but mine is errands, run some errands, ho go iron some clothes. Think it's apparent who's the parent, and I shine in my role. It's oddy-dotty, lottie-dotty, I'm a party on my own. Cop a hottie and she's acting naughty, she's up in the zone. I'm off some shotties and I'm talking potty, trying to get it done. If this was 1973, I would've put you on a stroll. In 1993, I would have you on the pole, but we've evolved. I like women with degrees and some goals, getting Z's at a decent hour when she make it home. No disease, keep that pussy clean, take care of them toes. She getting money, so all this shit she can do it on her own. Hit the gym, take your medicine, do your yoga poses. Here's a way that you can eat to feel full and fit them clothes. Call me late so we can pray and search the scriptures to behold. I'm a fixture in your life that's hard to replace when I'm gone, so weigh your words before you end up sitting waiting at the phone. Yeah, I'm patient, but the way I am, I'm living by a code. Let her know that dick ain't free, it costs a fee to get enfold. Yeah, I need something to hold. What's the story you compose? I'ma flip it. Don't you sell that pussy, let's go open up a business. Think I'm kidding, most are amazed at degrees in which I'm bold. But bitch, gotta be patient, be honest, do what you told. I see the innocence within the darkness in your soul, and with privilege present you with the way that you can mold to our benefit, cause best believe not only for your own. I ain't limited by they doctrines on the ways that things should go. I would rather just be honest with the way that I propose. But when I touch your soul, everything I say is gold. Can't wipe if she ain't solid, if you got somewhere to go. Can't be rocking with a mold. Gotta know what's your role. Does she surrender and follow you even if she doesn't know? Is she swallowing the seed that you were dropping in a dome? Are you watering and anchoring that shit with every O? Classic conditions and thinking of ways to make the ship grows without contradicting the principles and ways that you've shown. Does she appreciate rewards you give for when she's hitting goals? Does she know and can articulate the program in our role? Does she eagerly anticipate the feeling of the pole? Does she turn into a little girl around you like she's home? Oddy Dotty got some game for you to take it to the hole. Coach Brodie is the name, you gotta pay me for.
This is the Brodie method to shadow work. Now, I'm not sure exactly what it's all intended for everyone else. This process of shadow work started for me from a place of actually studying the Bible. It started for me from studying Romans 7 leading into Romans 8, right? Where it talked about the things that I don't want to do, I do. The things I want to do, I don't do. When I do good, evil is always present. When I do evil, good is always present. And what this represented in my mind is when it got to Romans 8:1, where it says, therefore, there is no condemnation of those who are in Christ Jesus, right? This is really where the path of me working on integrating my shadow really began, right? I got heavily into studying the understanding and the philosophy behind the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And recognizing that in life, to the pure, all things are pure, and to the defiled, all things are defiled, right? That's just some background. But for me, the Brodie method to shadow work takes place through this process of first going into the ego and assessing and addressing the things that are within your shadow and beginning to negotiate the things that are within your shadow with your morality until those things are in alignment, so that your shadow becomes integrated with your ego, right? And when the things that are within your shadow become integrated within your ego, to then integrate your persona with said ego, right? And then to develop an alter ego, or to develop a persona, that mostly accurately presents the things that are within your ego, that presents the things that are in your ego that's already integrated with your shadow, right? That you're in alignment with, so that you have a very honest and direct or forthright way of operating and carrying yourself. And then after walking in that persona for a long enough period of time, where the things that create positive outcomes, because what does the shadow really represent? The shadow oftentimes represents things that were pushed down due to social programming, to traditional values, and oftentimes for men, the effeminization of men through pop culture, through mainstream media. And it also represents things that are pushed down due to religious indoctrination. So part of that process of negotiating my shadow with my ego came from me going through a process of studying the scriptures for myself, getting deeper into etymology, getting deeper into understanding certain things in the Greek and the Hebrew, understanding certain things as far as scriptural interpretations, context, the right of first use, certain aspects and concepts when it comes to scriptural interpretation, so that I was in a place of alignment within myself, right? But this isn't all the alignment that takes place. Because the thing to understand is many people, they idealize the concept of being themselves. Many people idealize the integrated space when they haven't even walked into the high cup space, right? Many people idealize the overflowing cup space when they aren't even high cup. Low cup people who are like masculine, submissive, feminine, dominant, sometimes middle cup people, especially them too, where they feel like they're above the low cup space, now the middle cup space, and then they feel as if they idealize the integrated space when they haven't even walked into the high cup space. And the high cup space is masculine, dominant, and feminine, submissive, right? So most of the time you hear people talk about healthy relationships. Oftentimes relationships are going to be prematurely integrated for most people, right? Which means that the cycle of energy is not sustainable between the dominant and submissive egos of both people when it comes to the sexual level of that relationship. And they lack the tools to self-soothe properly on the self-preservation level in order to maintain that cycle of energy, and also lack the competency to gain energy on a social level for dominant ego validation, so that they have enough energy within their cup to sustain the cycle of energy on a sexual level when it comes to relationships. So what I learned to do was to use the persona, which was accurate to who I really am and how I really feel, to use said persona to put myself in a position where I could then begin to be competent enough to gain energy on the social level. Right? So what this turned into, casual sex. But then you also have going through a process of strengthening your level of personal security. You also have the process of learning self-soothing. You learn all these different things. You learn sexual alchemy, you learn sexual energy transmutation. And as you learn these things and you gain these capacities, what you have to recognize is that many people idealize the concept of just being themselves, but you have to know yourself first to be yourself. Oftentimes, people's idea and concept of being themselves is simply just being led by their emotions, being led by how they feel in the moment, when oftentimes this is something that's going to be either manipulated by a person directly, indirectly, or it's going to be something that's heavily sullied with social programming. It's going to be heavily sullied with the thoughts and perspectives and ideas of others. It's going to be heavily sullied by animus projection and anima projection, right? And shadow projection. And people want to focus so much on being themselves, but they haven't even developed themselves to be themselves. So oftentimes this leads to pushing certain aspects of who you are into your shadow. But one thing I learned, especially through Romans 7, is that when you try to do that, oftentimes it leads to a lot of Gnostic ideas, right? And what I mean by Gnostic ideas, it's this separation of the spirit and the body. This idea that we're just spirits in a physical body living a human experience, where we are individuals who have flesh, and this flesh is the physical body. I remember listening to certain spiritual teachers, like preachers, like Brodie, Greg Henry, different preachers of the Bible, and they would be talking about how the flesh is more so related to the human willpower, self-effort, and the human desire to justify oneself through our works, right? Justifying ourselves through our works, as if presenting this to God and presenting this to ourselves through our external works is going to be what gives us a sense of security, right? One thing that I recognize with this is that we are beings that operate on a social level, because we're social beings. We operate on a sexual level. I'm not talking about sex, because sex can take place on all three levels, but on an intimate level, on a level of safety and intimacy and closeness with a close partner. And then we're also individuals who operate on a relationship to ourselves and a relationship to God, which is the self-preservation level, right? That's what we are. So many people view flesh as just the physical body or the urges of the body. And by conflating the desires of the physical body, or the desires, the things that are within our ego, with the flesh, what we do is we vilify ourselves for being humans. We vilify ourselves for being humans in this experience. And to me, that's inherently Gnosticism, because we are vilifying the human body, the natural world experience, and elevating the spiritual without either discerning truly the spiritual or discerning truly the physical to assess what is what. And what happens when you vilify the physical body and you vilify the natural world as if this is something evil, as if God did not create it, right? It's like you have this mentality like you believe in the demiurge. I don't believe in the demiurge necessarily, right? That's more of a Gnostic belief. But when you have this perspective, what happens is that due to lessening the value of the human body, lessening the value of the natural world experience, seeing this as inherently evil, what you do is you focus so much on the spiritual that your shadow begins to overtake you. And due to your shadow overtaking you, you put yourself in a position where you have an inability to be self-aware of yourself, because to be self-aware of who you are and what's within you will lead to a nonstop sense of dread, a nonstop sense of fear and anxiety. So that means you have to hide these things from yourself in order to justify and accept yourself, right? And when you understand that, this leads to a lot of different issues. When you understand this, it leads to a lot of different things, that you have a lack of control over your behaviors, right? And with this lack of control that you have over your behaviors, it puts you into a position where you oftentimes live your life off of covert contracts, where you're living through the concept of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, meaning that you cannot see life outside of the concept of what's good and what's bad, rather than focusing on what is. There's a lack of concept of intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward. There's a lack of a positive concept of what it means to desire to be in control and to be competent with that control. That's the high cup space. When you are flowing in feminine energy from a submissive space, this gives you the capacity, right, to experience intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward when it comes to relinquishing control. And this also gives you the capacity to learn something that you don't have the capacity to teach yourself, or lack the motivation to teach yourself, because we have to understand the validational systems that are within the human psyche, the human experience. And masculine dominance is when you are honest about your desire to be in a position of control, and you develop the security and the competency in order to be in that position of control. This is where we move up into the high cup space, masculine dominant and feminine submissive, right? Masculine dominant and feminine submissive. Now, one thing I want to touch on real quick is the overflowing cup space of being the integrated masculine and the integrated feminine. Because what a lot of this is predicated upon is masculine security and feminine security, right? So masculine security is how strongly you stick to your boundaries, your principles, your values. Being more focused on the logos, being more focused on the ego, being more focused on the way that you want to do things over who you want to interact with, right? Masculine security is best coupled with dominance, right? Because masculine energy is something that stifles submissiveness. When you are in a submissive position, you greatly limit your capacity for intimacy. You greatly limit your capacity to experience intensity. You greatly diminish your capacity to learn, to grow, to leave a place of stagnancy and complacency when you are submissive from a place of masculine energy. Because this creates a transactional model where you judge yourself as good based off of your capacity to give what you think will meet another person's needs. Feminine dominance would represent the evil, right? Where through that evil, you find yourself in a position where you are doing what goes against another person's idea of what's right and wrong, and you're going against their idea of what's right and wrong in order to put yourself in a position where you are gaining the validation or gaining the resources or getting your needs met by any means necessary. This is where we talk about narcissism. This is where we talk about dismissive avoidance. This is where we talk about, these different concepts of things, right? Masculine submissive would be codependent, right? And feminine dominant would be, typically that would be narcissism, right? Sociopathy, the dark triad traits. But you can integrate these dark triad traits with your masculine security, your principles, your morals, your values. Now, this can oftentimes take place through cognitive empathy. So when we're talking about the integrated masculine and the integrated feminine, these are integrated individuals who have both masculine security and feminine security. Feminine security is your capacity to trust your intuition. It's your capacity to trust your feelings. It's the capacity to show compassion without expecting something in return, right? That feminine security is what gives you the capacity to trust what you feel. But what you feel could be something that's deceitful. So you need a combination of both masculine and feminine security. But if you do not choose which one you're going to primarily focus on, you're going to find yourself in a position where you're going to be unable to sustain that cycle of energy, and you're going to drop down a cup space, right? You have to understand core polarity versus fixed polarity. On whatever level that you're a fixed polarity individual, you are an individual who's probably in a high cup space, but from a perspective of having a high level of masculine security or a high level of feminine security, but maybe without having both, right? So when we're talking about anima and animus development, what does the animus represent? The animus for a woman represents her relationship to her own logic, her relationship to her own principles, her relationship to her own values. A woman typically is going to be loyal first to how she feels over anything else. Not the principle, but how she feels about the person, right? Because feminine security is about choosing a person over the principle. That's what feminine means, right? So when you're feminine, but you're dominant, you're choosing the person over the principle, but in a way where you seek to take control by any means necessary from a particular person or a particular situation or circumstance. That's feminine dominance, right? This is sexual polarity quadrant masterclass right now, right? Understand that. So the process is when you get to a high enough level of sustainability within that cycle of energy, and understand that alignment's going to take place through all three levels of these instinctual variants, which come from the Enneagram: social, sexual, self-preservation. It takes place through all three of these levels being in alignment. All three. Now, really, if you have two that are strong enough, that's why there's your first and then there's your secondary instinctual variant, right? So you could be SXSP, you can be SXSO, you could be SPSO, you could be SOSP, right? And then typically the last of the instinctual variants is one that you repress within yourself, and then it's going to take a lot of self-development for you to get to that place, right? Because what the instinctual variant represents when it comes to the Enneagram is where you go to recharge your battery. When your cup gets low, how do you recharge your battery? So if you're social, then it's interacting, going into a group of people, right? If you're sexual, it's a close, intimate relationship or a one-to-one interaction. So you can be an introverted individual who doesn't appear to be introverted, because anytime you're having a one-to-one conversation with somebody, you are very expressive. That's the type of person I am, right? I'm primarily a SX. I'm a 5'4" SX, SXSP. So for me, being social, it takes a lot, because it takes a lot out of my social battery, right? So a woman who reaches up, a woman may have a fear of how people will judge her based off of her concept of good and evil, taking the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And by taking the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a woman is placed in a position where oftentimes she's going to be within the loop of masculine, submissive, and feminine dominant. Same thing for a man. But for how a woman works is different, because most women are going to be primarily feminine or primarily submissive, right? Not all, but most are. Whatever you identify with first, and whatever you identify with and resonate first, because I believe that everybody has both an anima and an animus, right? Because I believe everyone has both an anima and an animus, whatever you identify with first is going to be your path towards integration. So for a woman, when you're in a high cup space, most women in a high cup space are going to be feminine submissive. But guess what? This is not based on principle. This is based off of her desire and her submissiveness and her emotional attraction and her sexual attraction to a man, right? Understand that. So when it's based off of this, a woman will find herself in a position where logic, in the face of someone telling her that she's wrong, or logic in the face of feeling as if she's wrong or she's done evil, is something that will oftentimes kill safety, right? Sometimes repercussions. Not always. When you're in a high enough level of feminine submissive, not so much. But once the cup gets low for a woman, oftentimes she's going to have an inability to think about the fact that she's wrong and to do anything to correct it, right? It's this hypo-agency, right? That's the feminine dominance. Why? Because the dominant and the submissive egos of men and women are different. What safety looks like for men and women is different, right? It's different. Oftentimes, a woman is going to value that emotional safety, right? And feeling valued, feeling heard, feeling understood. This is going to be primarily where her dominant ego is going to rely on emotional validation, social validation, financial investment, right? But on a more elevated level, it's going to be simply feeling emotionally safe. But that's not going to be a sustainable cycle of energy unless she's able to submit herself to a program that is above and beyond what her social programming is through her feminine security, and then to have her animus contend with that program, and then to adopt different aspects of that program so that she can be in a position of, when she's not in an extremely highly aroused, highly emotional state of mind, that she can still observe herself and make decisions that aren't being overly influenced by animus possession. That's animus possession, right? So understand that there's 4 stages to the anima and there's 4 stages to the animus. So the animus is typically going to go through that process of the muscle man or the bad boy, right? From the bad boy, it goes to the husband. From the husband, it goes to, because the husband is Mr. Fix-It-All. From the husband, it goes into the social leader, right? So a person that has social clout, or a person who's in a position of social power or control. And from there, it goes into someone who is a visionary and spiritual leader that extends just beyond, above just only a church setting or a social setting. This becomes someone who is a visionary. Those are the 4 stages of the animus. So the animus for a woman, it represents her relationship to her own masculine qualities that are within herself, because we all have masculine, feminine, dominant, and submissive within us. So for a woman, as she learns to integrate that masculine and that feminine, you have to understand that if you haven't excelled in one first and shown that you can operate out of that one first, then oftentimes by trying to do both, you got too much dip on your chip. And you're oftentimes going to flip-flop between your perspectives of being in that low cup space, masculine, submissive, or feminine, dominant. that loop that you find in Romans 7, right? That's oftentimes what will happen. So many times a woman will play the anima, right? Most people have a duplicitous mentality, the knowledge of good and evil, where there's the gentleman gigolo and the Madonna whore. So when a woman has a gentleman gigolo complex, this oftentimes comes from being prematurely integrated, where let's say she establishes a relationship or a connection with a man that has somewhat of a transactional nature to it, where she extends above the physicality level as far as her attachment to the man before she's fully been ingratiated into accepting and embracing her own sexuality and her own femininity. That's what premature integration is. And the hard part about that is oftentimes the price for premature integration with a woman is that if you aren't able to go into the integrated space, or if you aren't able to step into masculine dominance and walk away, and this doesn't draw her in from a high enough baseline of attraction, then oftentimes she's going to have to go through a process of experiencing men who represent only that initial level to her, which is the physicality and the sexuality, right? Very important concept to understand when it comes to the levels of animus development for a woman. It's 4 stages of it. But once a woman reaches the integrated masculine, she has enough logic when it comes to the situation to where she can trust her intuition, her feminine security, but it also has masculine security. It also has a certain level of backbone where she can take the program of that man, and without contradicting that program or the goal or the vision that's taking place for the man that's in her life, she's able to find ways of looking within her animus and to push that program forward in a way that benefits the man in her life, benefits the vision of that relationship, and benefits herself. It's win-win scenarios, because rather than being purely selfish, because understand this, feminine submissiveness is selfish as well. It's just, it doesn't appear to be selfish. It's just a selfish giver, right? Understand that. It desires to receive pleasure in exchange for the control that it gives up, right? Because to be dominant is the primary receiver of control, primary giver of pleasure. Submissive is the primary receiver of pleasure, primary giver of control. Very important concept to understand. So the integrated feminine is going to be a woman who has a capacity to, in the security, on a self-preservation level, in order to be able to sustain her feeling of safety, her feeling of respect, and what I call being in love, truly. And to love someone and to be in love with someone is to have the capacity to have a certain level of control over your anima and animus projection, to where a person who you can have a sustainable relationship with, that you love, who loves you back, right, is you have a capacity to project your anima or animus onto them in a way where you view them in a positive light, even if they are not in the most positive light in that moment. Now, if this isn't a sustainable relationship, then that will come off only as limerence, because the cycle of energy will not be sustainable, and therefore you will reach a place of being ultimately depleted. And if this isn't an individual who's masculine dominant, or this isn't an individual who has developed their masculine dominance, they're not going to appreciate that, and they're going to use and take advantage of you for projecting your anima or your animus onto them, because it's not a developed anima or animus, right? So that's the integrated feminine. The integrated feminine has a capacity to think beyond the projection of the idealism of what it means to be masculine, to be able to accept and embrace that there is femininity and submissiveness within a man, and not to be turned off by a man who treats her as if he values her, right? Who prioritizes her, who isn't quickly ready to just walk away. But premature integration, like I said, people who are prematurely integrated, they idealize the integrated space. So that means that there's a level of safety that you desire, but without being willing to provide a mutual level of safety to the opposite party based off of what they need to feel good about that relationship dynamic, right? Now, you can reach an integrated space on your own, but that really needs to be based off of your own self-preservation level of the cycle of energy. Needs to be so sustainable and so overflowing that even when things hurt your ego, you can provide your own safety. So we talk about the integrated feminine. They can provide their own safety and be able to move forward, also to have backbone and to push things forward. as a collective that's mutually beneficial. But then we also have the integrated masculine, right? Now, the integrated masculine is an individual who is in the overflowing cup space, as in you have to understand that there's 4 stages of the anima, right? The 4 stages of the anima are Eve, Helen, Mary, and Sophia. Eve represents the biology and the physicality of a woman, right? That's sex. Helen represents romance, dating, right? It represents artistic expression. It represents creativity. It represents your ability to intrinsically enjoy a woman's non-sexual company, but it's not purely non-sexual, it's her romantic company. Mary represents having the level of compassion that represents what people call agape love, or unconditional love, or a non-sexual connection, familial love, right? The love that you have towards a family member, or the love that you have towards an individual without an expectation of reciprocation. This is the 3rd level of the anima, which is Mary, right? And then on the 4th level, we have Sophia. And what Sophia represents is the wisdom of God. On this level, you have a certain feminine submissiveness towards life, or a certain feminine submissiveness towards what will be effective in that scenario without contradicting your principles and your values, right? So what the anima really represents is a man's relationship to his own emotions, his own femininity, as well as his projections and the way that in which he perceives women in general. So where a Madonna whore complex comes from is oftentimes when a man has skipped the stage and the steps of being able to connect to a woman on a foundation of Eve, right? When you don't have the height of the dominant experiences as a man of knowing what it feels like to be intrinsically sexually desired by a woman that you're interacting with, to see her sexual shadow, and to be the positive recipient of her sexual shadow, right? And to recognize that every woman has this capacity within herself to be this wild seductress, this very submissive woman, this very sexually driven woman. When you don't recognize that capacity within a woman, then the way that you relate to femininity is that femininity is chaos, right? Like when a woman has a negative animus projection, she perceives masculinity as cold, as callous, as rigid, as tyrannical, as toxic, right? When a man has a negative anima projection, he views women as sluts and whores, and as, as all different types of things that can be viewed as negative, right? Because that emotion, that femininity, it represents chaos. This isn't a elevated or an evolved type of feminine energy. He views femininity from a standpoint of feminine dominance, or of feminine submissiveness that's going towards someone else and not towards himself. So a man can become feminine submissive towards himself. He can become feminine submissive towards his own principles, his own values, his own beliefs, towards God. A man can develop his own feminine energy when it comes to the emotions that he puts towards his passions, right? The love that he has for his family, for his children, for his wife, right? These are things that are important. And in these dynamics, when a man has not experienced, right, this initial level of encountering the anima, meaning sexually, and experiencing that, then he's going to view the sexuality as a woman as inherently something that has to be controlled and has to be beaten down. Because if it is not, then things will get out of whack. And the truth is, to a certain extent, this is true. Right? To a certain extent, it's true. Now, some men play the animus, right? The gentleman gigolo complex. As in, one man may say, I want to be a good man. Another man says, I'm a bad boy. The bad boy is playing the animus, right? Because that's not all of who he is. He also has an inner child. He also has his inner femininity. He also has a capacity to attach unless he's emotionally damaged, right? Very important to understand. So when we keep these perspectives in mind, where the Madonna whore complex comes from is when you value a woman based off of the perspective of viewing her as a woman who is highly masculine and who lacks the capacity to be sexually uninhibited, right? And because you believe her to be a woman who lacks the capacity of being sexually uninhibited and of doing whatever, you give her credit, you give her a pass for not being that way towards you, because you perceive this as having a certain level of character in which, because she's not uncontrolled in her femininity, you feel that you can trust her not to hit you with paternity fraud, or not to embarrass you, or not to do certain things. But because of that, understand that a man still has a desire to deal with a woman on that sexual level, to deal with a woman who has that type of uninhibited desire towards him. So when a man has that perspective, if he is transactional, like if he hasn't crossed the first line of Eve, then that means that there's going to be a woman who he's transactional with sex for a long-term relationship, like marriage. That'd be married, right? That's where you're giving her your heart, right? Or you're giving her love in exchange for sex, right? You have Helen, which is where you're giving a woman romance in exchange for sex, right? And then you have Eve, right? And Eve is going to be on a level of, for some men, it's going to be desire in exchange for sex. For some, it's going to be short-term validation or games that you're playing in exchange for sex. Or it may be simply be a matter of you're just directly exchanging money, the whore, right? You're giving her some type of resource, whether it's emotionally, socially, or financially. And to the extent of how much you value the woman, that's going to be what you're giving her in exchange for access to her sexually and to have a sense of control over her, right? Now, Sophia is where you reach a place of having a certain feminine submissiveness towards life and towards what works and understanding reality, right? So from that place, you can understand a woman, you can relate to a woman, you can understand where she's coming from, you can be empathetic towards why she makes the decisions that she makes, because you have a similar connection to your own feminine energy to understand that life is in constant state of flux, that we never truly control anything. And that from this understanding, never truly controlling anything, that attempting to control something can make it leave. That attempting to control something can frighten it away. That it can make femininity feel unsafe. That's the Sophia level of anima development. So then you learn to create win-win scenarios. This is what the integrated masculine does, is to create win-win scenarios. The anima development for a masculine dominant is simply to be able to process your emotions well enough to walk away in moments where a person no longer desires your control, no longer desires your leadership, and then to walk away and then to be able to process those emotions and to transmute that energy into other areas in life. Right? Very important concept to understand. Right? So where you get to eventually is a place of developing that anima and that animus to get to a place of the high cup, but really to get to a place of the integrated space. So when you're a masculine dominant, you may have compassion towards people who you're not having sex with, and you may have compassion for certain things, but really you use most of your anima as an outlet for your emotions rather than pouring these emotions into a woman. Right? Is a very transactional model for rewarding good behavior in order to maintain structure. But if you skip this level, oftentimes, if this isn't a sustainable dynamic, it's prematurely integrated. And as the cups get low, you're going to drop down. You're going to drop down into, like, you get prematurely emotionally attached where your feminine energy is overstimulated. Then you can drop down into feminine dominant, or you can drop down into masculine submissive. And then you can become someone who is either domesticated or abusive. Domesticated or manipulative. Toxic masculinity, toxic femininity. Both of those things are real. Understand, toxic femininity is based off of hypo-agency. It's based off of a weaponized, assumed perception of innocence in order to accrue a mob to protect you. And sometimes that mob is not just a physical mob. Sometimes it's a social media mob. Sometimes it's a social war. Sometimes that is let me touch on something else real quick. When it comes to animus development, if a woman hasn't reached a place of her logic, her logos, and keep in mind femininity is eros. If a woman hasn't reached a place of developing her logos, her knowledge of self, her understanding, her values, of either getting with the man's program or developing values that go outside of just social programming, then anytime she feels unsafe, she will use her animus as a defense mechanism. It will possess her, it will overtake her, and through this possessing her and overtaking her, she will present a false view of herself that is oftentimes desexualized, maybe religious, maybe extremely socially programmed, maybe calling people toxic, calling them all different type of things, projecting a negative version of the animus onto a person, or projecting the gentleman as a front, someone who is not a sexual being, onto an individual in order to protect themselves from being stretched in a way that they are not ready for. Right? So this is why the masculine submissive is going to be more compatible with the feminine dominant, right, than the masculine dominant, because the masculine dominant is going to be too direct. It's going to require too much feminine energy, which is going to pour too much energy out, and then it's going to cause them to be stretched in a way where it's like a dry pussy getting a big dick put up in it. It's going to hurt. And that hurt reaction is like the cervix being hit. But when a woman's feminine submissive on a high enough level, and we're talking about sex here, when a woman's feminine submissive on a high enough level, she can have cervical orgasms. She can have throatgasms, right? She can have anal orgasms. Things that typically would be viewed as painful or uncomfortable, and she would present to an individual as something she wouldn't like to do. This is going to be something that becomes a point of the extent of how stretched and where the passions and desires are. This is an expression of how feminine a woman is, how submissive a woman is, how much she can be stretched. Now understand this, a woman oftentimes is not going to end up being with the most dominant man that she's ever dealt with, unless they're able to create their cycle of energy and make it sustainable. If it's the most dominant man she ever dealt with and they're able to create a sustainable cycle of energy, then they will be able to integrate through polarity, right? Because she's being stretched beyond where she's been stretched before with the good D and the guidance, the instructions, the leadership, the tutelage. And from this place, you can have a relationship that operates on polarity and then move into integration. But if a woman is sexually overstimulated, right? If she's sexually overstimulated, then oftentimes she will have to move up into integration on her own to be in an integrated relationship. You know, people talk about sexual past and body counts and stuff like that all the time. We have to understand that there's something called alpha pandering, and I'm somebody who is not exempt from it because I've taken the time to develop my sexual skills. I'm a sex coach. Because I've taken time to develop my sexual skills and capacity, I understand that I'm going to be more sexually skilled and more sexually dominant and have a better capacity to tap into a woman's feminine submissiveness than most men. Not all men. There's always a bigger fish. And even if you are the biggest fish, there's always going to be a man that woman's more sexually compatible with, who she's more attracted to, right? And this is where you have to understand this. Alpha pandering comes from a perspective of belittling the cost or the damage that being promiscuous can have on a submissive individual, right? Belittling that because you benefit from it. So you're pandering to the whore within a woman's Madonna whore complex in her own anima in order to have access to it by creating safety, by justifying a woman's behaviors that you don't care whether or not this is positive or negative to how this affects her and her capacity to pair bond, right? Some people have an issue with the concept of pair bonding. To me, pair bonding is not about how many people you've had sex with. It's about how far you've been stretched within your submissiveness through your feminine energy and how this affects your capacity to establish an attachment where you project your animus onto the individual the positive aspects of the animus onto the individual to be in love and then establish that attachment. And sex does play a part, and it does play a role in the factor of that. So, like, watch my video on concubine culture where I talk about this thing. You know, for a woman who is, like, if we're in a day and age in a society, like it's biblical times, where we're talking about, like, the Bible days, where most women would be in their father's house. They wouldn't spend a lot of time around men without supervision. And they don't talk too much about dating or casual sex in the Bible because maybe it wasn't as much of a thing then, but maybe it was. It really depends on the society. Understand this. In an androcentric civilization or an androcentric culture, some things that are toxic masculinity are going to be turned a blind eye to. Boys will be boys. There's going to be more violence. There's going to be more murders. There's going to be harsher punishments for toxic femininity behaviors, like a woman committing adultery would be stoned to death, right? There would be more of a concept of ownership and property, right? That's in an androcentric society or an androcentric culture. But when you're in a gynocentric culture or a gynocentric civilization, it's going to be more so closely related to, like, socialism. But there's also going to be a lot of subterfuge. There's going to be a lot of social manipulation. There's going to be a lot of propaganda. There's going to be a lot of a blind eye being turned to toxic femininity and its components, right? And you can tell that we're in a gynocentric culture right now because, listen, I've gone to college during this day and age when we're talking about intersectionality. When you're in a gynocentric culture, what happens is those who consider themselves victims, hypo-agency, these individuals are able to compile and stockpile all the different ways that they're a victim in order to accrue sympathy towards themselves so that they can have greater social power. Right? Understand that. And a lot of what feminism is about, and I remember hearing Marie-Louise von Franz talk about this, a lot of what feminism is really about and represents is animus projection, right? Animus possession. And many women will try to talk about being feminist, but they're not even feminine. They're idealizing the standards of what it means to be masculine. And through idealizing the standards of what it means to be masculine, they accrue these onto themselves. And I think this oftentimes leads to things like on a spiritual level, how it affects people physically. This is just my belief. I believe it's something that leads to, like, PCOS. I believe it leads to, like, fibroids. I believe it leads to depression. I think it leads to anxiety. It leads to a lot of things. But we're also in somewhat of a feminine dominant age. And I think this is something that connects to the concept of the age of Aquarius, where information is more released, things are more exposed, and within these things being more exposed, there is a greater capacity of it being like an air culture where people don't focus so much on attachment or having strongly, deeply rooted connections with individuals. It becomes more so flippant. It becomes more so dismissive, right? That's kind of the day and age that we're in. So I believe that in this day and age, trying to follow a traditional model in this culture of dating and relationships is not going to be as successful for most men who are raised to be traditional men with Christian values or Judeo-Christian values, because the women are sexually overstimulated, right? You have to understand the stages of it. If a woman is protected from being exposed to certain aspects of sexuality until she's already in an integrated relationship, then that man will probably be the best sex that she's had. Now, if she's exposed to it and the ideas and the fantasies of presence and the access is there, then oftentimes she may still end up being duplicitous, but it may happen less, right? But in order for a man to be able to accept that, he must first already have experience, either be integrated masculine or already have experience with enough women on a social level, right? Abundance on the social level, as in he has so many experiences with women on like sexually on a social level, to where he's confident within himself as far as his capacity, and then he just focuses on compatibility on a sexual level, meaning with that particular woman, to where he's gone through those stages of her Eve, her Helen, her Mary, and into Sophia, where she becomes a wise woman, or he goes through those stages of that within himself, right? where he becomes more understanding and malleable towards life and is able to go through those different stages of understanding to where he becomes very secure within himself. But outside of that, and most people are not on that level, what a woman's sexual experiences are and her capacity to be honest with the man and to have safety based on the reality of who she is and how she feels is going to be influenced by what her experiences are in the egos of most men. And some people would say, well, why not just do it and lie about it? Because the truth is this, that safety is going to be based off of intimacy, and that intimacy is going to be based off of honesty, right? A woman's going to be closest to the man who knows the most of what she truly thinks, feels, desires, and prefers, and accepts her within her truth. But alpha pandering would be false acceptance, where it's not truly a man who wants to invest in you, not truly a man who wants to care for you or provide for you or protect you or be with you, but simply a man who accepts the aspects of you that are whorish purely from the perspective of benefiting from that, right? So we have to understand the Madonna whore complex and the gentleman gigolo complex. But after going through these different stages, you eventually get to a place where after you've taken the shadow and integrated this into the ego, and you've taken the ego that has been exposed to the shadow and integrated with the morality and negotiated with the morality for the ego, then this is presented to the persona, right? And then this persona is something that is walked out until the things that give you a feeling of competency or that give you the capacity to be competent on a social level with your persona is developed. It becomes a situation where the things that are effective, they get down into your habits. Now, when this is no longer effective enough, this is where you go into the development of the anima and the animus. And the anima and the animus is going to be developed throughout this entire process. Due to the exposure to men and women that you have in life, you begin to understand that no one is truly only a Madonna or only a whore. That everybody has a mixture of all of these things, and that a true relationship, true intimacy is based off of a perspective of seeing that a person is a mixture. Everybody has masculine, feminine, dominant, and submissive within them. And then through this process, you come to a place of understanding the self. And then the self gets to shine through as the shadow, the ego, the persona, the anima or the animus. And then all these things are in alignment. Then the self shines through. And then you can pretty much, to a certain extent, get rid of the persona unless you need to use that persona to navigate certain social scenarios. Then you can use the persona to protect the more fragile aspects of yourself while making your persona something that is as closely related to who you really are and what you really desire and what you really want to do as possible. And then to save that self for your more closely intimate relationships or something that you can even expose to the world if you have a level enough of security to not be bothered by the scrutiny, to continue to develop the self, right? So, it's been a long time coming for me to make this video. I want to talk about my view on shadow work. This is Brodie's method towards shadow work. A lot of this comes from some of my understandings of spirituality, right? Because I remember, I got into BDSM I got into BDSM through Christianity, through studying the Bible. I learned that, a lot of the things when it comes to the knowledge of good and evil, the law came so that every mouth would be shut. The law came so that sin would abound. So that means that trying to push a legalistic, hyper-structured model in the individual of what they should do and not including their intrinsic desire or creating that desire within an individual simply leads to psychological reactance where Romans 7 happens all over again, right? So when the Bible tells a woman to be submissive to her husband, when the Bible says that, I took that and said, that must mean I need to learn how to be dominant in order to create a desire, a natural inclination towards being submissive towards me. Because one, there are no repercussions in this day and age socially for not being submissive. You see men trying to use the Bible to beat women over the head, to tell them what to do all the time. I've tried to explain things about the Bible to women before, and it didn't work, because a woman who has not developed her own animus is oftentimes going to curl. She's going to be defensive if she's presented with information that goes against her social programming, right? Even if it's accurate, even if it's correct. But then you also learn that different people have their own experiences. Different people have their own relationships to God, their own relationships to themselves, their own relationships to life, their own relationships to people. And that the wisdom of God is manifold, right? It's like there's many different perspectives, right? It's many different ways of looking at this perspective of God. And I'm not talking about, well, that's how you want to view it. You can, but I'm not talking about something outside of believing in Jesus. I'm talking about what expression of God in man on earth were you meant here to live out? Like it says in Psalms, ye are gods, right? Like in the Bible, in the beginning in Genesis, when it said we're going to make them in our image, right? It says we, like it's Elohim. That's the plural form of the word. When we're looking at it from this particular perspective, what we have to understand is this. This is what we have to understand. That when we're looking at things from this perspective, that each individual person has this spark that's within them. And this spark of life that God breathed into us, this life that we have, we are each an expression of God that is here on earth, right? And many people will look at that and say that it's some shit, but I don't care, right? Each of us, we have an experience to walk throughout this life, and it's going to express different aspects of what God wants to present to the world through us. And for each person, there's going to be people that we're compatible with throughout life, sometimes for seasons and sometimes for lifetimes, that are going to be things we need to show them and things that they need to show us. And through this understanding, we are able to reach a place in which our job is to walk that version, that expression of the many expressions of what God wants to share with us and express with us and express through us in life. And it's going to look different for different people. Like someone may have a weak conscience, someone may have a strong conscience, right? Different things. Some people are able to do certain things other people aren't able to do without this affecting their relationship with God. Sometimes it comes from a sin-stained conscience, and sometimes it just comes from, this is what your perspective is. This is your outlook on life. This is how things are for you. And I think that the better we understand this, the better. So, a lot of this is about my perspectives on life. A lot of this is my own personal philosophy, how I view life, how I view religion, how I view spirituality, how I view sexuality, and how these different things are affected, how these things affect each other, right? And this is Brodie's Guide to Shadow Work. It's Coach Brodie. I'm out.